Welcome back, folks, for our final installment of The Rise of Industry. This is part 4. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So we're going to talk about politics and immigration in this lesson. Okay, this is an overview. We're going to delve into these ideas in more detail in class, but this is a big picture overview of politics and immigration during the era. So, nativism. This is another ism. I hate this ism. It's basically hatred of immigrants and love of native-born, quote-unquote, real Americans. And unfortunately, this rhetoric did not die out with the Industrial Revolution. It continues very strongly up until this day. So what is it? Anti-foreign sentiment drove discrimination against immigrants and immigration limits as well during the following eras. So now, are there other immigrants that suffered? Yes. And we'll talk more in detail about those when we get into class and we discuss this in more detail. But these were the big picture, okay? 1840s and 50s, it was against the Irish. 1880s and 1890s, it was against the Chinese and Japanese. Matter of fact, Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882 that banned all Chinese laborers from entering the U.S. This was in effect until 1943, okay? So we're talking about, the middle of World War, and this is still in effect, unfortunately. So you need to know what this is. Chinese Exclusion Act, you need to know what it is. We're going to talk about it more in class. Antitrust movement. So we talked about trusts, right? We talked about antitrust. So I mentioned the Sherman Antitrust Act way back in the beginning, and that was in 1890. It prohibited any contract combination in the form or of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce, okay? Unfortunately, for the most part, it was too vague to be enforced. And in an 1895 ruling, the law could only be applied to commerce, not manufacturing. It would not be until the Progressive Era, which is our next unit, that you actually get convictions. Like I mentioned in the last video, we talked about Standard Oil and how they got trounced and had to separate into 34 companies, and that happened in the early 1900s. Okay, so this is a quote from this gentleman right here. As we view the achievements of aggregated capital, we discover the existence of trusts, combination, and monopolies, while the citizen is struggling far in the rear or is trampled to death beneath an iron heel. Corporations, which should be the carefully restrained creatures of the law and servants of the people, are fast becoming the people's masters. Okay, and this just symbolizes the significant problem that the trusts were causing in the American economy and larger American society. So in 1900, we led the way in industry. You can read this on your own. This is just to give you a big picture idea of where the U.S. was. The U.S. is not a world power at this point, but it will become a world power, as we know. And one of the reasons why it does is because of all of these things. Okay, we've got a lot of natural resources. We got a heavy labor supply, and our population is growing because of immigration. Even though there were there were nativist people, anti-immigrant people, but growing our population via immigration was a big reason why we had this huge labor supply and were able to expand in industry. We had an advanced transportation network, lots of capital, development of labor-saving technologies like the assembly line, hundreds of thousands of new patents, laws that protected private property. We've got subsidized railroads, a protective tariff, very little regulation on business, few taxes on corporate profits, and a lot of entrepreneurship. So this is a big reason why we led the world in industry at the turn of the century. The railroads. Remember, single most important economic factor of the 19th century, the railroads. Single most important economic factor. Remember that. Okay, so this is all very important. Actually, we get time zones because of the railroads, so they could better staff and run their lines of transportation. Eastern trunk lines. Okay, so there's a major route between large cities. Okay, Cornelius Vanderbilt used steamboat profits to merge local railroads. Again, remember Cornelius Vanderbilt, he was the railroad guy. He was the baron, or rather titan of industry. Baltimore and Ohio Railroad merged, and you also have the Pennsylvania Railroad. Okay, Western railroads coincided with settlement of the last frontier. What does that mean? That means that we completed our settlement of the west of the frontier because of railroads. Railroads made that the completion of settlement possible. Promoted a lot of settlement on the Great Plains to expand into the country and link the West with the East. So Western railroads are going to be really, really important for enhancing our industrial prowess. Now, when people look at you and say, oh, people did it on their own, they didn't need government to build their company, that's inaccurate. The railroads would have been nowhere if they hadn't received more than 170 million acres of public land for either free or for very, very little money. Okay. Government expected them to sell land around railroads in order to finance construction, but there were negative consequences from this land grab of the railroads, and you can see them here. We'll talk about the credit mobiler scandal in class. If I forget, remind me to talk about that. Railroads actually controlled half the land in some western states. They didn't sell it off. It was a land grab, and they kept it for themselves. They should have, but they didn't. Congress authorized the Union Pacific and Central Pacific to build during the Civil War. So eventually, they would end up merging, but they came together on May 10th, 1869 at something called Promontory Point. And that was, and they nailed in a golden spike to symbolize the connection of the East and West. And this solidified the connection of the entire country together via the railroads. So that's important. I want you to know that these railroads were built by the Chinese. Chinese immigrants built these railroads. 6,000 Chinese immigrants came and built these railroads. So remember that. We have industrial empires, which is a problem. I've talked about this before. We have a shift in industrial production in the late 19th century. We talk about that. Early factories produced textiles, clothing, and leather products. We had, because we started our industrial revolution before the Civil War, then we got interrupted. Then we had like another one, technically second industrial revolution after the Civil War. But this is part of a larger march towards industry. In that second industrial revolution, we get heavy industry, steel, petroleum, electric power, industrial machinery. The steel industry. Steel would be nowhere without Henry Bessemer, okay? The Bessemer process is what made turning iron into steel a much more streamlined, faster, more efficient process, okay? New process of making large quantities of steel. Without steel, you can't have cities. Steel is what makes skyscrapers possible. Without steel, there's no cities. So this is really, really important. And then we have some conservative economic theories. I talked about laissez-faire. I talked about Adam Smith. We don't need to rehash that. Those were more conservative economic theories. Now let's get into ideas. Okay, now this is my jam. Now, laissez-faire we talked about. Social Darwinism, I hate social Darwinism. It's disgusting, but you need to know what it is because it governed a lot of the social cultural interactions of the late 19th and early 20th century. This is the idea of Darwin's survival of the fittest applied to society. Riches deserve the wealth because they are strong, and poor are poor because they deserve it. That's that idea, okay? This also was applied to the races, not just economic and social classes, but also the races. Okay, white supremacy features prominently here. You need to know what social Darwinism is. We're going to talk about that in more detail in class. You need to know what it is. Gospel of wealth, and this is the idea that the wealthy have a responsibility to share their wealth for the good of society and setting a good example. This came out of Andrew Carnegie, and we're going to read excerpts from the Gospel of Wealth in class, and we're going to dig into that document in a deep way. And I already talked about Horatio Alger, or Alger rather. So again, this is a more detailed breakdown of social Darwinism. Again, it's disgusting. We don't like this theory, but it plays a super important part in history. It governed a lot of social, cultural, and economic exchanges, so you need to know what it is, okay? Concentration of wealth should be held by the fit, okay? And of course, the fit meant wealthy, Protestant, and white, and native-born American. That's what that meant, okay? And if you didn't do well, this was your fault. You simply weren't good enough. Okay, that's what this theory is all about. It's disgusting, but we need to know what it is. And I talked about this already, Gospel of Wealth. This is a bit of a more a detailed breakdown. And again, we're using religion again here. Okay, we're using religion again. So this Protestant work ethic, so this was anti-Catholic as well. This Protestant work ethic was used to justify wealth. If, you know, you were rich, that meant you were in God's favor, right? And then you deserved it. And if you were poor, that meant you had fallen out of favor with God, and you deserve that too. So that's the big idea there. Okay, so this is a comparison looking at both social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth. They went hand in hand. They worked together to create this idea that the rich deserved it and the poor deserved it too. So I need you to familiarize yourselves with these ideas. Again, we're going to talk about them more in class. So pause the video, write all this down. Important. Okay, so the arts, we get this development of this idea of realism, this strove to depict everyday life, literary and visual artistic movement from 1860s to 1890s. And there's also this idea of naturalism, this idea that nature was good and wonderful and beautiful. It's actually very similar. It's not the same, but it's similar in some of the ideas of glorifying nature, transcendentalism. Okay, religion and the social gospel. So the social gospel, this was prominent actually in many Catholic circles, which was interesting. And we'll talk more about that in class. But it was a religious movement that called for people of faith to engage actively in reform work and public activism, that it was part of your role as a Christian. Specifically, a lot of Catholics engaged in this, but also Protestants as well. But this is very strong in the Catholic area. It was a direct response to problems of industrialization, and they emphasized anti-poverty work, urban reform, and cooperation between religious groups. So there are many cases of Protestants and Catholics working together in an effort to achieve reforms and to help the poor. So, conclusions, the so what question. What can we conclude from the rise of industry? Well, we have the emergence of an urban society. This created suburban sprawl. This still dictates a lot of our lives today. This resulted in numerous inventions that help run our world today, or led to inventions that run our world today. Established a new economy that allowed the United States to develop into a world industrial, economic, and later military power. That wouldn't happen until after World War I, and really World War II, but it happened a little in World War I. Post-World War I, established the class structure that still largely exists today. We have massive immigration, and that is where we get the notion of the nation as a melting pot. It really starts in this era with the waves of massive immigration of folks coming from other countries to settle in the United States. Carnegie and Rockefeller did differ in their approach to business, but they were both monopolies. Okay, oil, steel, and railroad industries helped each other grow and depended on each other for success, and also depended on each other to maintain their monopolies. In less than 30 years, the U.S. became the leading manufacturer, transporter, and the richest country in the quote-unquote civilized world. America was fundamentally changed with the Industrial Revolution. As we said before, we led the world in industry, innovation, and wealth. Laissez-faire policies plus new business tactics got us monopolies. The gap between the multi-monopolists and their poor immigrant workers grew wider and wider and wider. You will see economic stratification is not a recipe for economic success in the long term. We're going to see this come to fruition as we continue on our march through American history. And that, folks, ends our video lessons on the Industrial Revolution. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.